They say that as you get older things fall into place, marriage, family, a good life, and they did. I married Steve, just like everyone expected, and we built a life that people would admire, a cozy home, a beautiful little girl, a marriage that looked solid from every angle. My friends from college would often say I had it all, and in many ways I did, but sometimes having it all can feel like being chained to an illusion. The small things should have been satisfying. Steve was a wonderful father, an attentive husband who kissed my cheek before bed every night and made sure the coffee was hot in the morning. I watched him cut the grass every Sunday, meticulously caring for the home we'd built together, and there was a strange comfort in that repetition, but it was just that repetition, and somewhere along the way I began to feel like I was fading. Our life, the one we built on love and shared goals, was now a series of routines, each day bleeding into the next with a familiarity that dulled my senses. The first time I noticed it was on a regular Tuesday evening. I was doing the dishes after dinner, and I caught my own reflection in the kitchen window. It struck me then the woman looking back at me felt like a stranger. I saw the lines around my eyes, the slight sag at the corners of my mouth, and thought, who is she? The realization crept over me, quiet but persistent. I didn't know who I was anymore. Our daughter was young, meeting me in all the ways that toddlers do, and I loved that role with everything in me. But with Steve I felt I had become something else entirely. I was his wife, the mother of his child, the keeper of his schedule, and the one who made sure his socks stayed paired. But what happened to me? It started subtly. I began taking long walks through the woods nearby, slipping out in the afternoons after dropping our daughter at preschool. At first it was just to clear my mind, to escape the monotony of our home and the endless cycle of laundry and dishes. I felt the pull of nature, the way the wind moved through the trees, and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. I found self craving that solitude, and in those quiet moments I began to feel the first hints of something I hadn't felt in a long time, the freedom to just be one of those afternoons. As I was wandering deeper into the woods than usual, I spotted a figure up ahead. My breath caught, an instinctive reaction to seeing another person in what I had come to think of as my private sanctuary. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a flannel shirt and worn jeans, bending down to examine something on the forest floor. I noticed immediately the rich tone of his skin, a deep brown that stood out against the greens and yellows of the leaves. Just as I was about to turn around, he looked up, meeting my gaze with an easy, friendly smile. Beautiful spot, isn't it? He said, his voice carrying effortlessly in the quiet of the woods. I nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. It's my favorite place to come, clear my head. Mine too, he replied, straightening up and dusting off his hands. I'm Derek, by the way. I introduced myself, and we chatted for a few minutes about the trails and some of the wildflowers blooming that time of year. It was the kind of light, friendly conversation you'd have with anyone, but as I turned to head back home I found myself glancing over my shoulder to watch him fade into the trees. That evening, when Steve asked how my day was, I almost told him about the men in the woods, but I stopped myself. Somehow it felt like something just for me. In the days that followed, my mind kept returning to that encounter. It wasn't as if there was anything remarkable about it, but something about Derek had felt refreshing, unfiltered. I found myself taking a different trail, wondering if I might run into him again, and a week or so later I did. This time he waved me over, and we walked together for a while, talking about everything and nothing. He told me he was from the city, but had been coming out to the countryside for a change of pace. We laughed about how different small-town life was from what he was used to, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was truly enjoying a conversation there. There was no pretense, no expectations, just two people sharing a moment in the woods. I knew there was nothing wrong with chatting with a fellow hiker, but I also knew there was a part of me, a part one hadn't felt in so long. That was waking up again. I looked forward to my hikes now, felt a nervous excitement about going back into the woods, about the chance of seeing him, and that small thrill, that stirring feeling became my secret, something I held close to my chest. It was as though I had started leading a double life, one foot planted in my role as a mother and wife, and the other stepping into a part of myself that felt wild and unknown. And as the days turned into Weeks I began to wonder if there was more to me than just this life I was living. I wondered if maybe, just maybe, this stranger I'd met in the woods might help me rediscover it. I became a little reckless with my time. Steve noticed, of course, the way my walks became longer, my excuses more frequent. You've really taken to those hikes lately, huh? He commented one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner. I could feel his curiosity hovering there, but I brushed it off, not looking at him. Yeah, I replied, careful to keep my tone casual. Just feels good to have a bit of time to myself. But it wasn't just that. Derek had started to become a fixture in my mind, an almost daily thought that felt as impossible as it was exhilarating. He was just a man I ran into on the trail, but maybe it was the way he talked or how intently he listened to even the most mundane things I said that began to fill the cracks in me I'd ignored for so long. He was a complete stranger, yet when I was with him I felt like I was seeing myself with a new clarity. Our encounters remained innocent. We talk about music, books, or what trails to explore. Sometimes we'd sit quietly on a fallen tree, letting the sounds of the woods fill the spaces between us. I'd learned more about him too. Derek was a photographer, he told me, and had spent years documenting life in the city. He showed me photos on his phone, gritty street scenes, breathtaking shots of towering buildings set against stormy skies. His work was raw, honest, full of life and emotion. One morning he brought a camera along. I figured you might want to see things through my lens, he said, grinning, and he did just that. He'd stop at a tree or an unusual rock formation, snap a picture, and let me look through the viewfinder. When I put the camera up to my eye, I felt as though I was looking at the world with new eyes, capturing details I'd overlooked. I've never thought of it that way, I admitted, setting the camera down after studying one of his shots of a dew-dappled path winding between trees. Derek looked at me for a long moment, a hint of something in his gaze that felt warm and familiar. Sometimes it's not the world that's changed, he said, his voice low. Just the way we're looking at it. The way he said it made my skin tingle, his words lingering in the air between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just talking about the forest or about photography. There was an intensity in his eyes, a slow, deliberate way he looked at me that made me feel well seen. It was as if Derek understood what I couldn't even put into words myself, the sense that somewhere along the way I'd lost myself, and maybe if I dared I could find that part of me again. Our conversations turned deeper. He asked about my family one day, and it was the first time I mentioned Steve. I talked about our daughter, how she loved animals and had a way of charming every person she met. Derek listened quietly, nodding, asking questions that felt genuine, and before I knew it I was opening up about my life, our home, even. Steve, it sounds like you've got a beautiful life, he said, his tone gentle. So what is it that brings you out here so often? The question hung between us as heavy as a stone. I could feel the truth in me rising, a part of me wanting to admit everything I wanted to say, that sometimes the walls of my house felt like they were closing in on me, that every day felt like another brick in a wall I was building around myself. I wanted to tell him that as much as I loved my life I'd forgotten how to live it. I guess I just need a little space, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze understanding. Sometimes we need space to find ourselves again. After that, our hikes became almost ritualistic. Derek seemed to sense when I needed to talk and when I just needed to be quiet. I'd never had someone make me feel so at ease, so comfortable in my own skin. With him I could laugh, even share pieces of myself that felt hidden in my own marriage, and soon I began to confide in him things I didn't talk about with Steve, my dreams, my fears, the things I wanted out of life that I'd almost forgotten about. But with each conversation, each shared silence in the woods, I felt a line being drawn. It was subtle, a line I knew I shouldn't cross, yet in the back of my mind I felt it, an awareness I couldn't ignore. Derek wasn't just a friend the way I anticipated our time together. How I thought of his laugh, his voice, his knowing eyes. I was treading on something dangerously close to a longing I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as we were sitting beside a stream, Derek handed me a he picked up from the water's edge. It was smooth, shaped by years of water flowing over it. He pressed it into my palm, his fingers lingering over mine. Take it, he said quietly. Think of it as a reminder that some things are carved slowly over time. And sometimes he added, his voice softer, we're the ones shaping them, his hand lingered on mine, his touch as soft as the breeze that rustled through the leaves above us, and for a long, breathless moment I couldn't look away. The touch was brief, but it sent a current through me, something I hadn't felt in years, a reminder that there was still a part of me that wanted that, craved that ach to feel alive. I walked back home that day with my thoughts racing, feeling as though a dam had broken inside me. I could still feel the warmth of his hand, the weight of that small smooth stone, and as I closed the door behind me, stepping back into the comforting routine of my home, I knew something was shifting. Derek had awoken something in me, a part of myself I'd buried under years of comfort and predictability, and that night as I lay beside Steve in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt a twinge of guilt. I hadn't done anything wrong, not really, but deep down I knew there was something between Derek and me, a quiet connection that felt like it was on the verge of crossing an invisible line, and for the first time I wondered if it was only a matter of time before I would. After that day, the pull to see Derek grew stronger. I started planning my days around those hikes, checking the weather, making excuses for longer trips out. I told Steve that I'd started meditating in the woods, that it helped with the stress and kept me grounded. It was half true. I did feel something calming out there, but it wasn't the trees or the quiet stream. It was Derek, the way he looked at me, like he knew the parts of me that I didn't dare show anyone else. We'd made it a habit to meet at the same spot by the stream, and when I arrived on a brisk cloudy afternoon, he was already there, skipping stones across the water. I could see his reflection in the pool, his figure dark and steady against the dappled light. He turned as I approached, a slow smile spreading across his face. You always sneak up on me, he said, his voice warm, playful. Maybe I'm just good at blending in, I teased back. Somehow I doubt that he studied me for a moment, his gaze lingering. There was something about the way he looked at me that made the rest of the world feel blurry. He had a way of focusing, of being entirely present, and that presence made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. We sat together on a fallen log, watching the water trickle over the stones. Our conversations had become a refugee, a place where I could speak freely without worrying how it might sound, or what it might mean. Derek told me about his family back in the city, how he'd felt the need to leave for a while to find some peace. He shared stories of his travels, the people he'd met along the way, the strange beauty he found in places others might ignore. At one point he looked down, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. You ever feel like you're just going through the motions, he asked, his voice low. The question hit me like a wave. I hadn't expected him to ask that, but he had a way of seeing through me. Every day, I replied, feeling a strange relief at saying it out loud. It's like I'm doing everything I should be doing, but there's something missing, and I can't even name what it is. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Sometimes I think we forget who we really are, buried under all those SHS. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Maybe that's why we ended up here, looking for something we can't find anywhere else. His words echoed in me, stirring something I hadn't felt in so long. We fell into silence, the air between us thick with unspoken thoughts. After a while he turned to me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a touch that was meant to be friendly but lingered just a little too long. It sent a spark through me, one that stayed with me even after he pulled his hand away. As we sat there, Derek leaned back, looking up through the trees. You know, he said, if you're ever up for a real adventure, a friend of mine's having a get-together next weekend. A few of us, some good music, good food, nothing fancy, just a bunch of people unwinding. He grinned, that playful glint in his eyes. You could use a night out, don't you think? I hesitated, feeling my pulse quicken. It wasn't a date, of course not, but the idea of stepping out of my usual life, even for a night, felt both thrilling and dangerous. I don't know, I murmured, my voice betraying a hint of doubt. Hey, no pressure, he said, his tone light, reassuring. Just think about it, you deserve a night for yourself. We let the subject drop, returning to our usual conversation, but I couldn't shake the thought of it. That night I lay in bed beside Steve, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I could actually do it, go to that party, be that person again. I could almost hear Steve's reaction, if he knew I was even considering it, and yet something in me longed for it, for a chance to be just me, without the roles, without the weight of Expectation. The week passed in a strange haze. I went through my usual routine. Taking care of our daughter, cleaning the house, preparing meals, but my mind was elsewhere, circling back to that invitation. Derek and I hadn't spoken since our last hike, and I hadn't committed to anything, but as Friday drew closer, I felt the tug in me grow stronger, a quiet urgency that I couldn't ignore. By the time Saturday evening rolled around, I'd made up my mind. Steve was out with some friends, a rare boys' night, and I decided to take the chance. I left our daughter with my parents, giving them some excuse about meeting a friend for a drink. My heart was racing the entire drive, over my palms damp against the steering wheel. The house where Derek's friend was hosting the gathering was tucked away, surrounded by trees, almost as secluded as the trails we hiked. I parked, my heart pounding, as I made my way to the front door, the muffled sound of music and laughter spilling out into the night. Derek opened the door, his smile warm and genuine, and a rush of relief washed over me. "You made it," he said, leading me inside. The atmosphere was casual, relaxed. A handful of people lounging on couches, a few others gathered around the kitchen island, laughing and chatting over drinks. Derek introduced me to everyone, and they greeted me warmly, welcoming me in a way that felt genuine. There was an openness and easy warmth that felt worlds away from the life I'd been living. As the evening wore on, I found myself relaxing, joining in on their laughter, letting the music seep into me. I even danced a little, laughing as Dirk spun me around. It was a simple, innocent joy, the kind of thing I hadn't let myself feel in ages. I caught glimpses of him watching me, his gaze lingering, and each look made my skin tingle, like a silent conversation passing between us. Hours went by, the sky outside darkening into a deep indigo. Eventually Derek and I found ourselves sitting together on a bench outside, away from the noise and laughter. The night was quiet, the stars scattered above us, and the cool air felt refreshing against my flushed skin. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice soft. "I know it's not easy to step out of your world." I smiled, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. "It feels surreal," I admitted, "like I'm someone else tonight." "Maybe it's just a part of you you haven't seen in a while," he murmured, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment there was no space between us, just a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of something we both felt but couldn't name. Our hands found each other, his fingers grazing mine, a gentle, deliberate touch that sent a thrill through me. We didn't say anything, but the air was thick with tension and unspoken desire simmering between us. The urge to close that last inch of space was overwhelming, almost painful. But then Derek smiled, and he broke the silence, guiding me back inside to meet his friends, 3 other men, each as welcoming and warm as he was. There was a casual intimacy between us all, a closeness I hadn't felt in so long. We shared drinks, laughter, and as the night grew deeper, the casual touches turned into something more. There was an energy in the room, something charged and unspoken, something I didn't want to resist. When Derek leaned in again, I didn't move away, and in that quiet house under the stars, with Derek and his friends around me, I felt that line I tried so hard to keep in place finally fade away. The house was filled with music, laughter, and the warm glow of soft lights strung across the room, casting a dreamlike haze over everything. The evening had taken on a new kind of intimacy, one I hadn't felt in years. Dirk's friends, each with his own easy charm and quiet confidence, made me feel welcomed, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The boundaries I'd clung to for so long, the lines I'd drawn to keep myself safe, suddenly felt like distant memories. Derek guided me through the crowd, introducing me to each of his friends. There was Marcus, tall and steady, with a calm presence that felt grounding. Then Jerome, who had a quick wit and a laugh that was infectious. And finally Trey, who had a quiet intensity, his gaze lingering just a little too long, like he could read me in ways even I didn't understand. Each of them greeted me warmly, the kind of attention that felt all too rare in my life lately, like I was the center of a room that wasn't my own. The evening wore on, and each shared laugh, each playful comment began to blur the edges of right and wrong. Derek stayed by my side, his touch a gentle reminder of that first quiet spark that had ignited between us in the woods. But now, surrounded by his friends, the spark felt like something much larger, a fire that had been smoldering, waiting to burn brighter. It happened slowly, a quiet glance here, a subtle Touch there, the warmth of their presence surrounded me. We were all closer than I'd ever been with anyone in years, and as the minutes ticked by, that closeness shifted, deepening, becoming more. It was Jerome who first reached for my hand, his fingers grazing mine with a softness that made my pulse quicken. Derek was watching me, a quiet, knowing look in his eyes, as if he understood the choice I was making, that he saw the longing I'd kept hidden for so long. In a gentle, unspoken rhythm, the room grew quieter as the connection between us deepened. The men surrounded me with an intensity one couldn't turn away from. I felt the warmth of Marcus's hand on my shoulder, Trey's hand in mine, the strength and presence of each of them blurring together, and suddenly I felt free in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. There in that room, I let go of every inhibition, every thought of restraint, and sank into the moment, giving into the fire I tried so hard to resist. It was intense, a whirl of emotions and sensations, each of them taking their time to connect with me in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. They held me close, each one a new electric touch, and as the night wore on, I lost myself entirely. By the time the room grew quiet again, the weight of what I had done settled over me. I felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt, both so intense I didn't know how to separate them. Derek stayed beside me, his hand warm on mine, giving me a gentle squeeze, as if to say he understood, that he knew the risks we'd taken and what it would mean to leave this night behind. I gathered my things, taking one last look at Derek and his friends, the memory of the evening still alive and vivid as I drove home. In the quiet darkness, the weight of what I had done began to sink in, but a part of me, a quiet part I'd long forgotten, felt alive, filled with the forbidden thrill of finally being seen. The weeks that followed that night with Derek and friends felt like a blur, a constant oscillation between guilt and memories I couldn't erase. When I was with my daughter or around Steve, I tried to be as normal as possible. I went through the motions, put on a smile, acted like everything was the same, but deep down I knew nothing was. That night had unlocked something in me that I couldn't put back in its box, no matter how hard I tried. But Steve noticed. He wasn't the type to say much, but he was observant, and he started asking quiet questions that grew sharper each time he would mention the hikes, ask why I'd been out longer than usual, or why I seemed distracted when we were together. I could see the suspicion in his eyes, but I kept my responses short, vague, hoping he'd let it go, and for a time it seemed like he might, until one night, when he came home from work, his face tight with a look I'd never seen before. He dropped his keys on the table and didn't say anything, his silence enough to make my heart pound. Did you have a good day? I asked, my voice too bright, too forced. Actually no, he replied, his voice slow and tense. I ran into Mark at the grocery store. He said he saw you at a party with Derek. The name hung in the air between us, and I felt a cold rush of dread wash over me. He said you looked close. Steve continued, his jaw clenched. Said you were spending a lot of time with that guy that other people had noticed too. I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it, to tell him it wasn't what he thought, but I couldn't form the words. He watched me, his expression shifting from anger to something much deeper, something broken. How long has this been going on? He asked, his voice raw, his gaze piercing. I wanted to lie, to find an excuse to make it all disappear, but in that moment I realized there was no way to undo what I'd done. The truth was too heavy, and I couldn't bear the weight of one more lie. It was just one night, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He closed his eyes, exhaling sharply as if he'd been holding his breath. Just one night, he repeated, his voice cracking with disbelief. How could you do this after everything we've built, after all these years? The questions came fast and painful, each one a sharp cut to the illusion of the life we'd shared. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words, telling him about how I'd felt invisible, how I'd lost myself, but it sounded weak, hollow. Nothing could justify what I'd done, and as I spoke I could see the hurt and betrayal deepening in his eyes. Steve's silence grew heavier with each passing day. He would come home late, barely look at me, and when he did, his gaze was filled with an emptiness that made my chest ache. Our conversations dwindled to small, curt exchanges, our lives now held together only by our daughter and the routine that had once been my comfort. He started sleeping in the guest room, and the sight of the empty side of our bed became a daily reminder of everything I had shattered. The distance between us grew wider, and every attempt I made to bridge it was met with silence, a barrier I couldn't break. The house became a place of quiet tension and unbearable silence, punctuated by small painful moments of avoidance. He would leave the room if I entered, stay in his office for hours, barely speaking to me unless it was about our daughter. The emptiness was suffocating, a hollow ache that echoed through every part of our home. I knew I had to face the consequences, but the reality of it was more devastating than I'd anticipated. I saw the pain in our daughter's eyes when she noticed the shift between us, the way she asked why Daddy wasn't at the dinner table, or why he didn't tuck her in anymore. Each question felt like a reminder of what I'd cost her, the stability in love she'd once felt so sure of now fractured. And then one evening Steve handed me a small stack of papers. My heart sank as I read the bold letters at the top: petition for dissolution of marriage. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice weary, void of the warmth it had once held. I don't think I'll ever be able to look at you the same way. I wanted to plead, to ask for forgiveness, but I could see from his expression that he had already made his decision. In that moment I realized there was no going back, no fixing what I had broken. Over the next few weeks Steve moved out, finding a small apartment nearby, close enough to see our daughter regularly, but far enough to keep the distance he needed. We agreed on joint custody, but even the thought of sharing time with our daughter felt like a reminder of everything I had taken from her. As the day turned into weeks, and the weight of the divorce settled over me, I found myself haunted by memories of our life together, the love we had built, and a future I had thought was certain. I tried to convince myself that I'd done what I needed to find myself, but in a quiet of the night I knew the truth. I had let a fleeting moment, a longing I couldn't contain, unravel everything that truly mattered. The guilt became a constant presence, a shadow I couldn't shake. I found myself retracing every step, every decision that had led to that night, wondering if I could have stopped myself, if I could have chosen differently. I could see now, too late, that the emptiness I felt had been a part of me that I needed to heal on my own, not through someone else. In those quiet moments alone in the empty house I began to reflect on everything I had done, every choice that had led me here. I had betrayed the trust of a man who had loved me, given me a family, and I had shattered the foundation of a home we had built together. I tried to make amends, sending messages to Steve asking for his forgiveness, but each attempt was met with silence, and maybe that was what I deserved: the silence, the emptiness, the weight of a love that I had taken for granted. Now as I stand in the house we once shared, surrounded by memories of a life that feels like it belonged to someone else, I am left to reckon with the choices I made. I had sought freedom, but what I had found was a cage of my own making, a prison of regret that I would carry with me long after the papers were signed. And maybe someday I'll find a way to forgive myself, but for now all I have is the quiet reminder of everything I lost, and a painful realization that some mistakes can never truly be undone.